Alright, so hello and welcome back. So we are continuing the series of Baz battles during World War II, and we are at the St. Nazaire Raid 1942, and it's an unfortunate fact that we're almost done with this series, which will be sad. I will cry a tear. Otherwise, the original video is in the description. Please go check that one out, and otherwise, let's get to it.
It's early afternoon of the 26th of March, 1942. 3 destroyers, accompanied by almost 24 motor torpedo boats and motor launchers, with a battalion-sized unit of British commandos aboard, depart from the port of Falmouth. Their mission, to hinder the ability of German battleships to operate in the northern Atlantic. One of the most audacious and spectacular raids of the Second World War is about to begin. It's the middle of January, 1942. The German battleship Tirpitz, the sister ship of the famed but short-lived Bismarck, sails into Trondheim Fjord in occupied Norway. Her mission is to both threaten the Arctic convoys, providing supplies to the Soviet Union, and also strengthen the German defense against a suspected British assault of Norway. Deployment of the Tirpitz to Scandinavia caused a significant amount of distress within the British Admiralty and for Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who believed that destroying or at least crippling the German battleship was among the chief objectives of the Royal Navy in early 1942. While one arm of the Admiralty sketched plans on how to destroy the Tirpitz anchored in Norway, another group worked on possible countermeasures in case the German battleship ever ventured out into the Atlantic. Several bigger vessels of the British Home Fleet were kept at the ready in Scapa Flow for such an eventuality.
Okay, no, just that home fleet, I get there's way more ships there than just those, right? But taken into context, just that versus the Tirpitz, the King George V and the HMS Duke of York, okay? Both have 14-inch guns. I believe the Tirpitz is armed with 15s. And then you have the HMS battle cruiser HMS Renown, which is very old at this point and not modernized. I think it has maybe some light modernization, but not anywhere near. Then you have HMS Victorious, okay, quite modern. So those 2 battleships are going to be very useful against if a theoretical engagement were to happen in the North Sea. Those 2 battleships would be very useful. The battle cruiser it may not be so because it's not meant to fight a battleship. And then the carrier is obviously very good to always have. And what happened to Bismarck?
But the Bismarck incident had shown that the presence of British battleships in the area could do little to discourage the Germans from using the Tirpitz as a commerce raider. Thus, their Admiralty planners came up with another idea to diminish the threat posed by the German Leviathan. Since the Tirpitz was a vessel of enormous size, not every dry dock was big enough to accommodate the ship in the case of it being damaged and in dire need of repairs. In fact, the only facility on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing the Tirpitz was located in the German-occupied port of St Nazaire in western France. If the local dockyard was somehow disabled or hopefully even destroyed, that would most likely dissuade the Kriegsmarine from risking the Tirpitz in the Atlantic.
So what they're talking about there is if a Atlantic raid by the Tirpitz was performed, basically like Bismarck, even though that ended terribly. It's the same thing. If that was to happen, their only place that they can go to repair and rearm is St. Nazaire, okay? Which would put them there. So if they blow up that, then the Germans have literally nowhere else to go besides like the main port of Brest, but that's been bombed to the basically daylights. So if they were to take out St. Nazaire, it has nowhere on the French west coast that it can operate from, which means it basically stays in Norway or stays in Germany's home waters, basically past Denmark down here.
At first, the British thought that a wave of air raids could render the port inoperable, but several months later, the command of the Royal Air Force realized that damaging the dock to a sufficient extent with bombing raids was virtually impossible, especially given the strong ring of anti-aircraft weapons around St Nazaire and the added risk of harming the civil population. Another way to disable the dock had to be found. Eventually, it was decided that a well-executed amphibious assault using a formation of British commandos would be a more effective way to complete the task. The details of this operation were entrusted to Churchill's protégé, Lord Louis Mountbatten, at the time serving as Chief of Combined Operations. Yet this assignment turned out to be far more difficult than it first seemed. while sabotaging most of the port facilities in a quick surprise raid was doable under favorable conditions, destroying the dock gates was a completely different matter. Achieving this required a huge amount of explosives and was simply beyond the capabilities of a single commando battalion. But the planners soon came up with another idea. An old US-built destroyer serving in the Royal Navy, the HMS Campbelltown, was to...
So I just want to point out the fact, this is what I was looking up, is so he is Lord Mountbatten. He's actually related to the royal family. He is a Mountbatten of German descent and was born in the Battenberg family, and he was the maternal uncle of Prince Philip, okay? Yes, that Prince Philip, the one that recently died before the Queen, okay? Yes, he was his maternal uncle, maternal grandfather, let's see. He was his maternal uncle of him, right? So yes, that same dude was in charge of special operations. We're just going to roll this back. Okay, so the Normandy dock, again, they would have to take this out. It's basically immobilized. You can't take it out with an air raid. It's basically what is going on here. And they're going to have to send commandos in to do it. Now, how do you blow up a dock? Let's find out.
Came up with another idea. An old US-built destroyer serving in the Royal Navy, the HMS Campbelltown, was to be modified to look like a German torpedo boat and, being laden with explosives, used to ram the dry dock's outer gates at night. This plan was initially met with some opposition within the Admiralty leaders and the officers of the Royal Navy. But in the beginning of March 1942, Operation Chariot, as it was dubbed, was approved. Extensive training of the troops began even before the plan was authorized, and both the commandos and the sailors spent weeks in training to gain the required proficiency in demolitions and urban combat, learning the nuances of the port installation in St Nazaire at the same time. Concurrently, the HMS Campbelltown underwent some vital modifications. 2 of her 4 funnels were removed, along with all unnecessary equipment.
Now, I believe HMS Campbelltown is a Clemson-class destroyer, which we will find out real quick. Campbelltown is a, so it was a U.S. destroyer that was the, Wickes-class destroyer. I was wrong. Basically, these were a whole bunch of destroyers that we built during World War I and then right before, and then a little after too. And we're like, well, these are all pieces of shit now. We kind of need to sell them because we had ridiculous amounts of Clemson and Wickes class destroyers, and they weren't very good. They weren't very useful. But the U.S. exchanges of bases, so bases, destroyers for bases. That deal gave the British a whole bunch of old destroyers that they could use. Campbelltown is one of them. So it really does make sense instead of cutting down. British were building destroyers, by the way. They had modern destroyers they were building. Instead of scrapping or using one of those, why not just use an old one, packed full of explosives? Problem is solved. It doesn't really cost you that much, and it still works. So that's why it's Campbelltown.
Some extra armor plating was added should the Germans recognize the ploy and take fire at the vessel. Finally, the modified HMS Campbelltown arrived at Falmouth in Cornwall, from where the entire group of 3 destroyers and almost 20 smaller craft departed in the afternoon of the 26th of March, steaming south. The beginning of the mission went as planned, but on the early morning of the next day, the British flotilla met its first problems. While passing Brittany, they were accidentally spotted by a German U-boat. The group opened fire, quickly forcing the enemy to submerge and retreat. The whole operation could have been compromised before it had even begun, as the U-boat's captain relayed his sighting to German command. But because the British were traveling directly south and not along the French coast, German command assessed that the flotilla was not an immediate threat, possibly heading to Gibraltar, and took no action to intercept. In the evening,
so that's lucky point number 1 right there. Spend a little luck point, yeah. So again, it wouldn't be uncommon for British, ships to move to Gibraltar. That happens. That's what the commander reported. That's what German High Command thought was happening. So why bother? If the ships were more hugging the coast, yeah, that would be a little more of an indicator that something was going to go down.
The group reached a checkpoint around 65 nautical miles off Saint Nazaire, where they changed course towards the Loire estuary. leaving their destroyer escort behind. The German naval ensign was flown on the modified HMS Campbellton to further liken it to the German Raubvogel-class torpedo boat as the group closed the distance to St Nazaire. At about midnight, 90 minutes before the planned attack, the monotonous drone of the British bombers over the city heralded a bombing raid, preparing ground for the commando assault. The night was lit up with the flashes of explosions, but thick cloud cover foiled the effectiveness of this attack. To make the bombing even harder, the Germans extinguished their searchlights in the port, fearing the bomber crews would use them to locate their targets.
Now, it is important that those bombers go in regardless. Why? It's very simple. The British have been doing this for at least a couple months now, okay? And they figured it wasn't working. However, the Germans don't know that. So, if the bombers suddenly just stop bombing you, you'd be like, is something going to happen? Because that's a little unusual, right? If they keep bombing you, as counterproductive or as counterintuitive as this sounds, if they do keep bombing you, you're like, oh, well, it's just business as usual. We're going to miss, we'll turn off our searchlights, and then we can go back to sleeping after this, right? So it gives you a false sense of security.
In the meantime, the convoy entered the Loire estuary. Using the advantage of high tide, the HMS Campbelltown could avoid sailing through the constantly patrolled main shipping channel and use the ordinarily more difficult path of shoals and mudflats. The British flotilla was already about a few kilometers from the dock gates, steadily sailing through the mouth of Loire. The Germans used a naval signal light to demand the identification of the incoming vessel, but the sailors aboard the Campbelltown managed to maintain the disguise by using an intercepted German short signal book. For a time, this ploy confused the crews of the shore batteries, buying valuable time for the British.
And that's very important right there, because if they open up a little sooner with these guns will tear apart the exploding explosive-filled destroyer, right? One of these shells happens to be high explosive, and it penetrates the hull, and it hits the other explosives in the hull. I mean, everything's going to go boom, right? So that just having the little signal book right there is going to confuse them, because again, the Germans don't want to fire on a friendly vessel, because that's how you get demoted and court-martialed. So like, okay, well, they're sending something, and they have to go look at their book, and then they look at it and they're like, huh, that's off. That's not what it's supposed to be. And then they'll signal again, so it's buying time.
But the deception didn't last, and eventually every German gun in the bay opened fire on the British vessel. The Campbelltown, blinded by searchlights and shelled from every side, increased her speed to 19 knots and changed course straight to the dock gates. The shore batteries scored multiple hits but were unable to stop the destroyer. Eventually, the British ship rammed the gates, thrusting about 10 meters into the dock and crumpling her bow while the destroyer tilted upward. The commando squads hastily disembarked the wrecked Campbelltown, leaping onto the dock to engage the Germans in the port. Other British motor launchers and motor torpedo boats were already landing their complements, beginning the second phase of the raid. A standard firefight ensued as the British commandos struggled to destroy the anti-aircraft guns and provide cover for the demolition squads attempting to blow up the pumping stations and as much of the port infrastructure as possible.
Again, this is important. So not only are they going to blow up this little dry dock here, that's why this is not trying to do this. This is a little area, but in reality, this is the dry dock. And how you can tell a dry dock is, there's two gates, and then this area is dry, which means if you put a ship in here and then you pump out the water, you can work on the bottom of the hull. So what's happening to the USS Texas right now. Now, you blow the whole gate out, you blow the whole thing out. It's really hard to repair something like that. It's going to take time. And they're also blowing up infrastructure, fuel pumps, spare parts, anything that's that can be used to repair a ship. They're basically blowing up, and they're also giving time for the demolition teams to do their job, which is blow the whole destroyer.
The raid proceeded more or less as planned, but the German units in the town were able to quickly reorganize and, with the support of an infantry regiment that joined the engagement at 2 a.m., put massive pressure on the British commandos. As a result, within the next couple of hours, the raiders were pushed back to the docks, and many British were either killed or wounded. The retreat was made even more difficult, as many of the landing boats were sunk, and only a fraction of the landing squads managed to evacuate. The last of the British soldiers who were cornered in the town were overwhelmed by the next morning. The losses on the raider side were staggering. almost 170 of the Royal Navy sailors and commandos perished in the attack, while some 200 more were taken prisoner. This, however, was not the end of Operation Chariot.
Now, there's only some 460, I think, combined sailors and commandos. That's basically pretty much your entire force is wiped out. Now, if they're willing to suffer that high casualties, which they were, to take out the dock here and stop the turbines from in the Atlantic, I mean, that's a very high price to pay, but that's what special ops is for.
Shortly past 10 a.m., German officers were investigating the damage caused by the British destroyer. The wreck also attracted a considerable number of infantrymen, as a rumor spread that the ship was provisioned with a hefty amount of liquor and cigarettes. It was then that the detonators aboard the HMS Campbelltown ignited more than 4 tons of depth charges, and a violent explosion shook the port, killing more than 300 soldiers and civilians. The detonators were meant to trigger the explosion 5 hours earlier, but despite the delay, the ultimate goal of the raid was achieved. The huge dry dock in St Nazaire was completely destroyed and was beyond repair up until the end of the war. The amphibious attack on St Nazaire port was quickly picked up by the British propaganda as a great victory over German hegemony. Though the British commandos and sailors conceded significant losses and failed to destroy some of the port facilities, the most important target, the dry dock, was put out of commission for several years. Thanks to their sacrifice, the possible area of operation for the German battleship Tirpitz was significantly reduced, and further tipped the balance in the favor of the British in the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic.
And that's a very good point he made. I mean, they sacrificed a lot. I mean, those commandos, right? But unfortunate fact is you can probably train more commandos in a few years compared to if you need to knock out that dock didn't get repaired the entire war, which is very significant, okay? So we'll read these and we'll wrap this up. So first, initially the St Nazaire Raid was to be performed using an old Free French destroyer, Ojan, I think, as the Admiralty leaders were reluctant to sacrifice a British destroyer. Yet the idea was eventually discarded as it required the cooperation of Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, and a difficult individual to cooperate with at the best of times. Yeah, that's basically saying he was an asshole and almost impossible to work with. That's why nobody in the Allies really wanted to. HMS Campbelltown was one of the few vessels exchanged as part of the destroyer for bases. There we go. Deal between Great Britain and the USA for 50 warships transferred to the Royal Navy. The British ceded land rights to some overseas territory possessions in the British West Indies. I think we gave those back, by the way, or they became free later in the Commonwealth, because the United States doesn't own them, fun fact. And then number 3, the extraordinarily large dock at St Nazaire was built in 1932 to house the SS Normandie, which at the time of her launch was the biggest and fastest ocean liner in the world. The damage the dock suffered in the British attack was enough to put it out of service till 48. Think about that. I mean, the French, 45, at the end of 45, right, is when the war ends, and then you have 46, 47, 48 to rebuild. But again, more pressing issues to repair other stuff in France other than the ship. Dry dock it is. So, hope you guys liked that video. Click up here for the Tokyo raid, and I'll see you next time.